Hello and welcome to Portfolio Matters. In today's Portfolio Matters, we will be discussing the South African vanadium miner and vanadium flow battery investor, Bushveld Minerals. But before we do that, Richard will read the disclaimer.
Thank you, Keith. Everything discussed during the Portfolio Matters podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. Listeners should be aware that we will be discussing securities that we own or have a financial interest in. Please do your own research or consult a professional investment advisor before making any decisions regarding topics mentioned on the show. A full disclaimer can be found at the end.
Okay, Bushveld Minerals. We have yesterday done a share talk on vanadium, and that is a precursor to our share talk on Bushveld Minerals, and I hope you will all take the chance to have a look at that presentation before watching this one. Okay, so Bushveld Minerals has operations in South Africa. This is its Vametco plant, which is nicely old school. And it also has stakes in vanadium redox flow battery producers and is moving into electrolyte rental. So it is moving into the clean energy space. Its share price is currently about 19p. Market cap, though, is 288 million. Net debt 16.1 and revenues in 2020 around 92 million. No dividend. And loss-making in 2020. Okay, so in summary, this is an interesting story, which is not what I expected. I have shares in this, and I had bought them on the basis it was a vanadium producer and with exposure to VOFBs. But actually, it's more interesting than that. This is a dynamic growth story with quite a dynamic management, and we will go into that. So it's aiming to produce a vertically integrated vanadium producer with exposure to VOFBs, but market cap's already 228 million. And quite a lot of the good news is already in the price to me. So we think this is interesting, but it's not necessarily a multi-bagger in the way that Rambler Metals was quite obviously potentially a multi-bagger. We're not sure that this is. Now, I'm also well aware that there's a large number of private investors on the shareholder register in Bushveld Minerals, and this analysis is likely to be less positive than they would like. Now, and I would like to put in a plea that if you disagree with us, please don't just say that's awful, but actually tell us why we're wrong. And if you think we're wrong and you can convince us that we're wrong, we will change our minds. So there is a whole website which has been created by a private investor about Bushfield Minerals, and it's called the Bushfield Perspective. And if you're interested in Bushfield, I urge you to take a look because it's very good. And I used it myself in producing this presentation. Now, this is the share price. Now, Bushfield actually started off as essentially a shell. And then in 2017, it announced the first acquisition of a vanadium producer, Vametco, and then in 2019 it acquired a second one, Vancam. And you can also see the share price has followed the vanadium price, which we showed you yesterday, and is prone to these spikes, which were caused by anticipation of higher Chinese rebar standards, which would require more vanadium to be put into the steel. Further details on that can be found in our vanadium presentation. The vanadium price has been ticking up recently. It's now about $7 a pound in Europe, or $35 a kilo. But in the long term, this is rather a small blip, and it blipped right up in the 2018-19 spike. So an overview of Bushveld. It has two branches. So the main part of the business is in mining and processing vanadium ore. But then it has a separate new segment, which is focused on the VRFBs and has some strategic investments in Invinity, which is a UK VRFB manufacturer, and Enerox, which is an Austrian one. And those strategic investments are to, in part at least, to establish itself as part of the supply chain to those two companies. And it's developing an electrolyte manufacturing facility, and it will then aim to rent electrolyte to both Enerox and to Invinity. And so that is coming. And they have got planning permission to start building the electrolyte plant. They're also involved in the development of a mini grid close to their plant. So they're going to actually put in a solar and VRFB battery mini grid close to their plants so that they're to provide them with power. So they're kind of showing that they can do this. So where are they? Well, they're in South Africa in the northeast, and the Metco is down here, and there's a nearby mine to supply it, the Brits mine, and the Vancam is close, so they can actually move resources between the two, and the Mokopane mine, which needs development, and they have plans for, their aim is to supply Vancam from Mokopane. Right now, Vancam is receiving third-party ore. And this is the Vametco plant. So this was acquired in November 2017 for 11 million. Now, bear in mind that the market cap of Bushveld is 228 million sterling now. So, why were these things so cheap in the first place? Aerial view of the mine and the operations, very old school. And then in 2019, they acquired Vancam. Now, let's go into Vancam. So Vancam went bust. They went into business rescue in November 2015, partly because essentially steel production in South Africa is proving to be quite difficult because of the Eskom supply issues, and also it's a high cost jurisdiction, which is a long way from the prime markets. It was then recommissioned in Q3 2018 when one kiln was put back into operation of the three with third-party ore. So the mine that originally supplied it, the Mapox mine, was closed when the business went into to administration. And the plant composes of a salt roasting plant with 3 kilns, one of which is in operation, an electric smelting ferrovanadium converter, a aluminothermic smelter, a vanadium chemical plant, and a rail siding to link it to the national rail network. So it is well positioned. What is the rationale for the Vancam acquisition? It cost them $68 million. And at that time, it was processing 960 metric tons per annum. And it has now got back to 1,100 metric tons per annum, and with one kiln in operation. The idea is that they're going to invest 45 million to refurbish the plant, get all 3 kilns in operation, and then also invest in the Mokopane mine at the cost of 20 million, and eventually get annual production up to 4,200 from Vancam alone. Very much so. Currently, Vancam is producing 1,100.
So actually, Bushveld is going for 10% of current vanadium production,
Yes,
global vanadium production.
absolutely. So in our presentation yesterday, we estimated that the total annual production of vanadium was either 111,000 metric tons or 102,000 metric tons in 2019, depending on who you believed. So why did Vancam go bust? Well, Evraz, who they bought it from, was part of Roman Abramovich's company. They are saying it went bust because of high costs, operational difficulties, and sustained losses in a capital-constrained business. It wasn't helped by electricity supply disruptions and rising electricity prices. And also in the when vanadium prices spiked, it produced a supply response which led to a oversupply in the market. Is that a warning? And this is an overview of the mineral side of the business. So you have Vametco and Vancam, which have been bought as separate businesses and essentially do the same thing. So they've got two plants producing vanadium, and vanadium for either chemicals or to be used in steel. So although it says that these Nitrovan, AMV, and MVO are separate products of Vametco, they're all essentially inputs into steel. Now, Bushfeld Energy, essentially Bushveld is aiming to get into the VRFB market and is developing an electrolyte facility, which is now approved for construction. And it's also deploying, it's bidding for work from Eskom. And there are some contracts outstanding which we are awaiting Eskom's decision on who the preferred bidder is. But Bushveld are part of consortium bidding for work. And it has investments in VRFB manufacturers. So Vametco H1 essentially lost production due to COVID disruption, and costs went up as it had higher COVID costs. But this year, you see the big ramp up in production. So you're going to recover from the disruption, and you're aiming for 2,700, 2,850 tons. They have funding from the government, the development fund, to help with development of Belco, which is the electrolyte company, and that is coming. And VRFBs are hopefully a growing market, so that is all positive. Now, if you look at the Ebitda Waterfall last year, not great. Now, vanadium price, very sensitive to the vanadium price. So vanadium price collapsed, and massive fall in Ebitda, and then there was increased costs. And bear in mind, that is despite reduced production. So you had reduced production, fall in price, and big increase in costs. Actually, they did increase production last year. There's an increase in sales volumes. Apologies. Now, this is where we start to really diverge from the sales forecasts from Bushfeld, in that they are saying that the vanadium market is going to go into supply deficit in the coming years. And if you saw our presentation on vanadium, separate presentation, you'll see that we are deeply skeptical about that. If the market for vanadium went into deficit, it would cause a price spike, which would destroy the market for VRFBs. It's quite a small market. Bushfeld alone are aiming to increase their production from 3,300 tons to eventually 10,000 tons. And bear in mind, that's about 9% of the market. And also, there are other producers, and we'll come on to that, who can massively increase their production.
So, Keith, can I just chip in there? Because I'm looking at the demand for vanadium since 2011. I've got a graph here where it was about 70,000 tons in 2011, and In 2020, it's around 120,000 tonnes, so that's a 50,000 tonne increase. But if you look at the price graph over that time, and obviously you do have that spike, but actually if you take out the spikes, the graph, the price is remarkably stable at around about $7 a pound, and that's with a so like an 80% increase in demand over the last 10 years, but also that's approximately the 6,000 tonnes a year increase in demand over the whole period of which, apart from the spikes, which look like they're speculative spikes, the price has remained constant.
Absolutely.
So it seems to me that the vanadium extraction industry is able to adjust the supply required to keep the price at around about $7 a pound.
Yes, that's absolutely right, Richard. And apparently about $7.50 a pound is where the marginal producer is.
Right.
And the other thing we'd say is that in our presentation yesterday, we talked about how in the Earth's crust, vanadium has twice of the abundance of copper, but the vanadium price is twice the price of copper, which is wrong. So, if there was a real need for vanadium, there is no shortage of it. You could produce a lot more.
So what I noticed from this chart, Keith, is that the down the bottom right-hand corner, it says Vametco, Brits and Mokopane comprise a total JORC compliant resource of at least 550 million tonnes. Now, I think that's at around about a 2% vanadium content. So that's roughly 10 million tonnes of vanadium, which at 100,000 tonnes a year of demand is 100 years global demand in the one resource. So it strikes me that there would be very little problem in matching supply to meet demand in the vanadium market, effectively ever.
Yeah. The aim is that Bushveld will eventually move to 10,000 in total, but currently the plans are 4,200 from both Vametco and from Vancam, and that will require financing, but they've largely got the financing. So the Vancam are currently 1,100, but over time, by 2025, they're aiming for 8,400. Okay, so the investment proposition: growth to 8,400. Owns two of the world's 4 largest primary vanadium processing facilities, and it's aiming to become vertically integrated with battery technology. Guidance, medium term. So in 2020, Vametco is going to produce 2,700 to 2,850, medium term 4,200. Vancam produces much less currently, 4,200 in medium term. They're going to develop Mokopane, and they're going to develop the Bushfeld Energy. But notice we don't have any earnings. We don't know what earnings Bushfeld Energy is going to produce. So, make it up. Potentially that's very bullish, but we just don't know. So Bushfeld Energy, it's the dedicated VRFB subsidiary, and it's currently in the process of building this electrolyte plant, and they've got planning permission, but they haven't built it yet. Stakes in Invinity and Enerox, as I've said, with rental agreements with the two of them. So they have agreements to supply both Invinity and Enerox with electrolytes and this new electrolyte rental model. And it's bidding for various ESCOM contracts, but as yet I haven't found any announcements. And if you saw our presentation yesterday, you will see that VRFBs are getting traction around the world, particularly in China, where they're building enormous ones. 1 gigawatt, so 1,000 megawatts, is that a gigawatt? But batteries, and these are enormous and will require very substantial amounts of vanadium. Their two investments are Invinity. They used to have a larger stake, but they now have 5%. They sold some of it to fund Belco. And Enerox, which actually operates under the name CellCube, is wholly owned by a consortium that includes Bushveld. And they are building a mini grid to supply Vametco. It's going to comprise a 3.5 megawatt hour solar PV farm plus a 1 megawatt / 4 megawatt hour VRFB. So it's 1 megawatt power, which can be run for 4 hours, supplied by Enerox. And so there's slightly something self-referential about this investment in that, they own Enerox. And then if you go on the Enerox website, they talk about this being one of their big contracts. And ultimately, they estimate that Vametco, Vancam, and Bushfeld Energy could use 125 megawatts of solar power. So, 125 of these if they were to become independent of the grid. Yeah. So, and as we know, the South African power company Eskom have problems and are being split into 3 companies. And, power supply is an issue. So Capex plans. For 2021, they're expecting Capex of 33.7 million, 5.3 in Vametco, 15 million in Vancam, and some in Mokopane, and then more in Bushveld. So this is, this is a growth story. And it's got these revolving credit facilities, and it's done some mine financing, total of 65 million. So it has the finance. Now, the dynamic management, this is the CEO, Fortune Mojapelo, and he is a graduate of Harvard and McKinsey. So he's kind of behind this growth story. It started off as an investment vehicle, remember? So he's, pushing this into vertically integrated vanadium producer. And they've just appointed a new operations director, which is good, but begs the question, what? They didn't have one before? And so he will be overseeing the operations at Vametco, Vancam, and Belco, and making sure that the input prices, the cost of production doesn't go too high. Now, looking him up, it does beg the question, what happened at Vedanta? He was there as director of operations for 6 months. And then he was, after that, for 18 months, he was an independent consultant, which means he probably got fired or something happened. Let's do some numbers. Let's assume that in 2025, they hit their sales target of 8,400 tons of vanadium, that the vanadium price is $35 a kilo, and it's currently at $33.55. So we're saying basically
that's sort of like nearly $300 million of turnover, Keith.
Yeah. And then we assume that cash costs fall substantially from where they are now because they're going to have economies of scale, which gives them a decent margin. And so on that, they get operating profits of 126 million. And those are quite generous assumptions, I would say.
I guess the point is it's very vulnerable to, as with all miners, it's very vulnerable to shifts in the price.
Yeah, absolutely. But bottom line is, if we work through these numbers, and I think these numbers are pretty generous, frankly, then we get to decent operating profits. Now, I did have some problems with the tax rate. So there are 2 brokers who cover this, and their forecasts were wildly different, particularly on the tax rate. So SP Angel were quoting a tax rate of basically 11.5%, while ARC were quoting 34.4%. Well, I've taken the South African corporate tax rate of 28%, and that matters because, you calculate PE post-tax. So that gets to post-tax net profits of 75 million, which is about 53 million sterling. And given the current market cap is 226, your PE ratio coming in 4.5. Okay, so forward PE ratio, and bearing that in mind, that's 2025 of 4.5, but that does not include any profits from Bushfeld Energy. So that would be plus, that would reduce the PE ratio further. So what are the PE ratios of the big miners? And bear in mind, they don't have just jam tomorrow. They've got jam today. They're kicking off dividends and earnings right now. And so Rio Tinto is on 8.2. These are all numbers from Stockopedia. Anglo American 8.5. So, if this re-rated as the expansion plans came to fruition, you could see that the PE ratio would double to 8 or 9, in which case over the course of 4 years to 2025, you would hope that the share price would double. And if you have more earnings from Bushfeld Energy, that is all plus. However, when we talked about the market for vanadium, vanadium is abundant. And there's another company on the London Stock Exchange called Ferroalloy Resources, which is a Kazakhstan developer of vanadium and has a big open pit mine, which could frankly transform the whole industry. So let me read this. The development of the Balasource-Kandik mine is going to transform the world of vanadium. We can meet the rapidly expanding demand from battery storage as well as for the steel industry faster at a fraction of the capital cost per annual ton, at a far lower cash production cost than any existing or planned vanadium producer. And their bottom line is they have a resource that is capable of producing 55,000 tons a year. Now, bear in mind that the annual market is about 110,000 tons. So they're well aware that if they develop this, it would kill the entire market. So they've got medium-term plans to reach 22,000 tons. So what is this Balasource-Kandik deposit in Kazakhstan? Well, the thing is, it's not magnetite. It's a black shale deposit containing vanadium, uranium, molybdenum, aluminium, and rare earths. And that means it doesn't need roasting. It doesn't need high temperature roasting to get the salts out. You can acid leach it. It's much cheaper. Production is much cheaper. At $7.5 a pound, they're talking about profit margins of 80%, best part of. Cheap. Current production is minuscule, 250 tons per annum, and that's up. They started off at 144 last year, with immediate aims to get it to 1,500 tons. And then, this is a big if, they need 100 million to build a plant, and then they get the production right up. So,
and because they're not the marginal producer, Keith, the price would stay, presumably the price is going to stay around about $6 or $7 a pound, and they will be, if they can produce it at that price, they will be making enormous profits.
Well, they would, but the danger is, Richard, that the higher cost producers who have to roast, they become the high cost marginal producer. They could be driven out of business.
Yeah.
If the market fails to expand, they could be driven out of business. Now, the one thing you would say is if the vanadium price collapses, that is great for VRFBs. And perhaps the demand for VRFBs builds up to rebalance the market, but that might take some time.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's back to Bushfeld. So positives. Dynamic growth management with growth plans, exposure to VOFBs, which are all very nice, and clean tech, and clean tech is definitely in, and people are making strategic investments into clean tech. However, as you will have seen in our video of yesterday, VOFBs really haven't got much traction in the West. In China and Japan, they are getting traction, but in the West, not really. It's mainly lithium ion. So, but Bushveld are very well positioned to be a key supplier into VOFBs should they take off. And they're building this mini grid to demonstrate all the technology in South Africa. They've appointed a new director of operations. The vanadium price is towards the bottom end of its range, and there definitely is some scope for it to appreciate in the short term. And it's building this new electrolyte plant, and it's got these growing exposures to China, which they are trumpeting. They've been increasing their exports to China in recent years, and they are bidding for work from Eskom. Negatives. Well, they're taking on debt. There's always the danger of cost overruns in the refurbishment of brownfield sites, such as Vancam, so it cars execution. It's currently loss-making, is expected to be loss-making in 2021. It reaches target in 2025 of 8,400, at which point it will be solidly profitable at current vanadium prices. There's some maintenance going on at Vametco, which is going to reduce its current production, but that should be over by the end of this quarter. But above all, we are just deeply skeptical that there can be any sustained price in the price of vanadium. And frankly, if ferroalloy resources plans of expansion come anywhere near fruition, then the vanadium price could really come under pressure not in the short term, but in the medium term. Also, Eskom, they have all these plans to increase production, but that requires power, and Eskom are a problem. I know on the one hand, they are bidding for contracts to start supplying Eskom with battery technology to help alleviate Eskom's electricity supply problems. But at the same time, they need power to power the kilns, etc. So how much is that going to affect their expansion plans? Also, their forward PE ratio, the bottom line is they bought all these assets quite cheap, and combined, they now have a market cap which is a multiple of what they paid for the constituent parts. And I know they've taken on some debt, etc., but you have to believe that they're going to get all this to work. And even now, they're on a multiple of the constituent parts. In order to make a return, you have to believe that the price is going to go up substantially from here. Now, it's on an estimated 4.5 PE ratio on 2025 production. Now, I know that excludes the VOFB, Belco, and the energy part, but we could see it doubling in the next 4 years, perhaps, and maybe that's enough. But it's not a multi-bagger, an obvious multi-bagger like Rambler Metals was. And the other thing is they own this coal mine in Madagascar, which slightly undermines its ESG credentials. So, in summary, it's a dynamic growth story, aiming to produce this vertically integrated vanadium producer. But how much is already in the price? And it makes a big play of appreciation of the vanadium price. Frankly, we don't see it. In the medium term, I'd actually be slightly concerned about the vanadium price, just on the basis of ferroalloy resources alone. And there's no shortage of vanadium. Richard, your thoughts?
Well, thank you very much for that really interesting presentation, Keith. As ever, very well researched. I just had a quick look while you were talking as well. Apparently, China produces 60% of the world's vanadium. And it's easy, the Bushfeld can't possibly be a play on the price of vanadium. I don't see that the price of vanadium is going to go up because demand increases, unless demand just goes utterly ballistic. Because there's so much of it around and it seems to be so easy to expand. And with China producing 60% of it, I would imagine the Chinese wouldn't have any particular difficulty in ramping up their production significantly quite quickly. So I don't see it as a play on price. is it a play upon increasing demand? In other words, the profit goes up because your price stays constant, your costs stay constant, and your volume goes up. Well, possibly, but that's very dependent then on the VRFB market taking off. And at a 6% annual growth rate in demand, then all things being equal, the increase in profitability of a company growing at that rate is going to be 6% per annum. So, it's not, for me, it is not a clear cut
I agree.
growth stock.
But I agree with you, Richard. I mean, I think there is upside here, and as their plans come to fruition, then the uncertainty around that should decrease, and the price should naturally go up. And you'd hope that if and when it is up and running, then its P ratio was stable around 8 or 9 from 4.5 at the moment. So there's definitely upside.
Yeah.
But I don't see the bull case based on massive increases in the vanadium price.
Yeah, I agree. And as you say, ferroalloy could cause quite a lot of damage to the market. Also, it makes you wonder, well, is Kazakhstan the only resource of that type of vanadium mineral? And if there are others and people start to develop those, then the existing extraction system just will fall apart.
Yeah, no, last time there was a spike, there was a big increase in production from Brazil. Okay, so I'm sure there will be some Bushveld Mineral bulls out there who think we've got this completely wrong. And please just let us know why you think we're wrong. If you can convince us, we will change our minds.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much, Keith, for that presentation.
You're very welcome. And so I hope you enjoyed that. Please, can you press like and subscribe to the channel? And in the meantime, it is goodbye from Richard Wheater.
And it's goodbye from Keith Jordan.
Goodbye.
Full disclaimer. The material and information contained in this podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon for making a business, legal or any other decision. We may own or have a financial interest in any securities mentioned. Listeners should conduct their own research or consult a professional investment advisor before making any decisions regarding topics mentioned on the show. Whilst we endeavour to ensure that the information presented on the show is correct, we make no representations or warranties of any kind, express or implied, with respect to the podcast and website or to any information, products, services or related graphics discussed or presented in the podcast or website. Any reliance you place on such material is strictly at your own risk. You are solely responsible for the investment decisions you make. We will not be responsible for any errors or omissions in the podcast or website, including in articles or postings, for hyperlinks embedded in messages, or for any results obtained from the use of such information. Nor will we be liable for any loss or damage, including consequential damages, if any, caused by a reader's reliance on any information provided by the podcast or website. Please do not listen to the podcast if you do not accept self-responsibility for your actions.